Caleb Thornton had been away for 2 weeks, leaving his small, isolated cabin tucked away in the remote Wyoming wilderness. The wind howled through the pine trees as he approached, but it was the sight of smoke curling up from the chimney that made his heart race. He had left no firewood prepared, no reason for a fire to burn, and no one was supposed to be here. A sinking feeling gripped him as he pushed open the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, but it was the sight of the elderly couple hunched over the hearth that stopped Caleb cold. They were thin, too thin, and their clothes, though once fine, were now ragged, barely hanging from their frail bodies. The woman's skin was paper thin, her eyes wide with fear, and her hands trembled as they clasped the old man's arm. The man himself was even worse off. His leg was wrapped in a hastily tied bandage, and his breathing came in short, labored gasps. The woman's voice cracked as she spoke, her voice weak and strained. "Please don't send us back. Please." Caleb stood frozen, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed them. These weren't ordinary wanderers. The man was hiding something metallic under his coat, something that caught the light just enough to hint at its danger. Who were these people? And more importantly, where were they running from? He took a cautious step forward, his boots creaking on the floorboards. "What's happened here?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The old man's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, fear, or maybe both. But before he could speak, the woman, the one called Martha, spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. We've been hiding here for days. The men, they're after us. They'll kill us if we're found." Caleb's instincts flared. He'd lived on the frontier long enough to know when someone was lying. They were too well dressed, too out of place in this desolate corner of Wyoming. Their clothes, despite the dirt and damage, had been made with care, and the soft hands they both carried spoke of a life far removed from the harsh conditions of the wilderness. They were hiding something, but what? And why? He quickly set to work. His first priority was getting them fed and warm. The fire had already dwindled down to embers, but Caleb quickly fed it some dry kindling, coaxing it back to life. He fetched water, heated it slowly over the flame, and then prepared small portions of food for them. Too much would only make them sick, but something had to be done. The woman, Martha, was burning with fever, and the man, Samuel, had an injured leg that was only getting worse. Once the immediate danger was managed, Caleb stepped back, assessing the situation. The cabin was small, cramped with a heavy sense of isolation. This wasn't the kind of place someone would willingly seek shelter unless they had no choice. After the couple had eaten a small meal, Caleb took a seat across from them, watching them carefully. "So, tell me who you are," Caleb said, his voice blunt. "What's your story?" Samuel shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering to Martha before answering. "I'm Samuel, and this is my wife, Martha." His voice was strained, but not from hunger. He was hiding something. Caleb could feel it, like a weight pressing down on the air between them. Martha opened her mouth as though to say something more, but Samuel cut her off sharply. "We've been traveling from the east," he said quickly, "just looking for a place to settle." Caleb didn't believe a word. "Traveling from the east, huh?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "You've been out here in these parts for a while." Martha's eyes flickered with panic. "Before the mine," she said, before quickly trailing off, her face going pale. Samuel's sharp gaze silenced her, but it was too late. Caleb caught it. The mine. The conversation paused, Caleb's mind racing. There was something about the way they moved, the way they spoke. Everything about them fell off. Then Caleb noticed something else. Samuel's tarnished pocket watch, the one that had once been polished to a shine, but now looked old and weathered. Despite their disheveled appearance, it was clearly worth something, and so were their boots. Caleb's gut twisted with suspicion. This wasn't some poor couple fleeing from nothing. They were running from something dangerous. "There are men hunting us," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dangerous men. Men who'll kill anyone who helps us. The words sent a chill down Caleb's spine. As a man who had survived the frontier alone, Caleb had learned that sometimes helping people wasn't as simple as it seemed. He could feel the weight of their danger pressing against him. He had always helped those in need, but this was different. They weren't telling him the whole truth, and Caleb could see that. He had a choice to make. Should he turn them into the sheriff or help them? His mind raced, torn between his natural instinct to protect and his knowledge that sometimes helping could get you killed. That night, as Caleb settled down to sleep with his rifle close by, he heard Samuel talking in his sleep, his voice low and frantic. "The ledger, they'll hang us for the ledger." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. The ledger. Whatever Samuel and Martha were hiding, it was dangerous. And now, Caleb knew he couldn't just walk away. The stakes had gotten much higher than he had ever imagined. At dawn, as Caleb prepared coffee, his eyes caught a glimpse of a small, folded newspaper clipping that had fallen from Samuel's coat pocket. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The headline read, "Mining Baron Harrison Blackwell offers $5,000 reward. Missing accountant and evidence believed stolen." The date of the article was 3 weeks ago. Caleb's stomach dropped. $5,000 could buy a man's soul in these parts. And Harrison Blackwell? He owned half of Wyoming and had left a trail of ruined lives in his wake. Whatever these two elderly folks had stolen, Blackwell was willing to kill for it. Caleb's decision was made. The tension at breakfast was palpable as Caleb unfolded the newspaper clipping, placing it in front of Samuel and Martha. The color drained from their faces when they saw it. Samuel's hand trembled as he reached for the paper, his eyes quickly scanning the words. Caleb sat back, his expression firm. "I need the whole truth, or you leave now," he said, his voice leaving no room for hesitation. There was a long silence before Samuel met Caleb's gaze, his eyes weary and resigned. He took a deep breath, his voice heavy as he began. "I was the chief accountant for Blackwell Mining Company," Samuel confessed, his voice low, almost inaudible. "I discovered something I shouldn't have. Massive fraud. Blackwell was stealing from investors, manipulating records, but that wasn't the worst part." He paused, looking at Martha with a mix of sorrow and regret. The worst was what he did to the miners. The collapse at the mine, 17 men dead because Blackwell cut costs on safety. Martha's hand tightened around his as she spoke for the first time, her voice shaking. "We couldn't stay silent. So, Samuel confronted Blackwell, but Blackwell didn't care. He offered a bribe first, then threatened to kill us both." She wiped her tear-streaked face. "We fled, carrying the evidence. It's hidden in my dress lining." Caleb's heart sank as he listened. The ledger they were talking about wasn't just a record of theft. It was a damning record of lives lost, families destroyed, and corruption that could bring Blackwell to his knees. Samuel, his voice still calm despite the danger, continued, "We knew if we didn't expose Blackwell, more men would die. So we kept the records, and we ran." Caleb's mind raced with what this meant. Blackwell was no ordinary villain. He controlled everything around here. Sheriffs, judges, even the law. If Caleb were to take the evidence to the local authorities, they'd never be able to survive. He'd heard rumors about Blackwell's power, how he could get anyone to turn a blind eye for the right price. Caleb glanced at Samuel, who seemed to sense the dilemma. "I know what you're thinking, Caleb. You can't trust the law here. But the only way to stop Blackwell is to get that ledger to someone who can do something, someone who can't be bought. A federal marshal in Cheyenne," Samuel added, his eyes pleading for Caleb's understanding. Caleb thought of his ranch and the two hands, Tom and young Billy, who were back there, the only ones he could trust in this situation. His gut told him he couldn't leave the ranch undefended. Not with Blackwell's men possibly already on their trail, but also told him that helping these two wasn't just a matter of kindness. It was a matter of justice. After a moment of silence, Caleb made up his mind. "You can stay at my ranch," he said finally, his voice decisive. You're too weak to travel right now. I'll take you to my place, and we'll figure out how to get this evidence where it needs to go." He turned to look at the distant horizon, the weight of what lay ahead settling in. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be without danger, but Caleb knew that helping them was the right thing. "We leave in the morning," Caleb said, his tone resolute. He could feel the heavy responsibility settling on his shoulders, knowing that the decision he had just made would change everything. As Caleb helped Samuel and Martha prepare for the journey, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much darker path. And as the night drew in, a shadow loomed over the ranch, the first sign of danger that was sure to follow them. The next morning, Caleb would lead them to safety, but the closer they got to Cheyenne, the more certain he became that they weren't running away from danger. They were heading straight for it. The days following their arrival at Caleb's ranch were filled with a tense, anxious quiet. The wind howled through the trees as Caleb, Tom, and Billy worked tirelessly to fortify the house. Windows were shuttered, doors reinforced, and rifles were placed in strategic locations. Samuel's health was deteriorating despite Levise's best efforts with her herbs and potions. Martha, too, was weak from her fever, but she insisted on helping, offering advice on how to improve the medicine and doing her best to help with light chores. Caleb barely slept. His thoughts raced with the weight of the decision to take these two strangers in. Despite the cold, Caleb worked the land as usual, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind felt like a reminder that Blackwell's men were still out there, looking for them. Samuel had shown him the ledger, a thick, leather-bound book filled with years of carefully documented evidence. The pages were filled with the names of dead miners, amounts of money paid under the table to politicians, inspectors, and even sheriffs, all for Blackwell's greed. The ledger wasn't just about fraud. It was about lives destroyed, families torn apart, and a community built on lies. As Caleb flipped through the pages in the quiet of the barn, he saw it all: the bribes, the manipulations, the murders. Blackwell had blood on his hands, and the evidence Samuel and Martha had hidden in their possession could bring him to his knees. Caleb's stomach twisted with anger as he thought of the miners who had died in the collapse, of their families who had never known the truth. He could almost feel their spirits hanging over him, demanding justice. But even as he held the ledger, Caleb knew the hardest part of all lay ahead. Getting this evidence to the federal marshal in Cheyenne wouldn't be easy. Blackwell owned the law here. Every sheriff, every judge, every politician was either in his pocket or too scared to cross him. If Caleb went to the local authorities, he would be signing their death warrant. There was no other choice. They had to get the ledger to Cheyenne. They had to get it to someone who could do something about it. Caleb sat on the porch that evening, staring out into the dark, thinking of the route ahead. The journey to Cheyenne was long, 250 miles across unforgiving terrain. It was dangerous, and if Blackwell's men were already on their trail, it was only a matter of time before they were found. That's when Levisa came out to join him. She sat beside him, her gaze distant as she watched the stars twinkle in the cold night sky. Her presence had become a comfort to Caleb in the past few days. There was something calming about her quiet strength. Levisa had been through her own share of hardship. Caleb knew her story. She had lost her husband to a freight accident years ago, a tragedy caused by none other than Blackwell himself, who had undercut her husband's business dealings, forcing him out of the market. When Caleb had first met Levisa, she was a widow trying to hold together her small farm, fighting against the odds to keep it afloat. Her resolve had been one of the first things that drew him to her. And now, she was the one who had taken charge of nursing Samuel and Martha back to health. Caleb glanced at her, noticing the quiet sadness in her eyes. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice soft. She turned to him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Just thinking," she replied. "It's hard to imagine a man like Blackwell ever being brought down, isn't it? A man who controls everything, who can destroy lives without a second thought." Caleb nodded. It's hard to believe it'll happen, but it will. We're not alone in this. Levice's eyes met his, a look of determination in them. I know, she said firmly. We'll make sure of that. The following morning, Caleb gathered everyone for a quick meeting. The plan was simple but risky. They couldn't all travel together. Blackwell's men would be able to spot them too easily. They would split up, taking different routes. Caleb, Samuel, and Tom would head north on horseback to Cheyenne, hoping to reach the federal marshal before Blackwell's men caught up with them. Levisa and Martha would take a stagecoach south, using the cover of the town to blend in. Tom and Billy would lead a false trail with a wagon, heading west to confuse anyone who might be following them. The key was speed and deception. If they stayed in one place for too long, they would be caught. The group had barely finished discussing the plan when a rider appeared on the horizon, riding hard toward the ranch. Caleb's heart sank as the man drew closer, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was well-dressed, too well-dressed for someone who belonged in this part of the country. Caleb's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his shoulder, his fingers curling around the stock as he waited. The stranger approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the ranch as he pulled his horse to a stop. Looking for someone? Caleb asked, his voice guarded. The man's cold eyes flicked over Caleb, a faint smirk crossing his lips. Just passing through, he said smoothly. But I've heard rumors about an elderly couple. One of my associates has been looking for them. I've lost their way. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Caleb's mind raced, his heart pounding. This was it. Blackwell's men had found them. He forced himself to stay calm. I don't know anything about that, Caleb said, his voice steady. Just family here, nothing out of the ordinary. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, Mr. Thornton, he said, tipping his hat. I'm sure I'll be seeing you again. I'll let you know if I find them. It's not good for a man's health to cross Mr. Blackwell. He tends to be unforgiving. With that, the man turned and spurred his horse forward, riding toward town. Caleb stood there for a moment, his hand still on the rifle. Before he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This wasn't going to be easy. The ride to Cheyenne was going to be harder than he'd anticipated, and the closer they got to their destination, the more danger they would be in. He couldn't trust anyone. The town was divided. Some people still remember the old days when Blackwell was a rising star in the mining world. Others had grown to hate him, but fear was a powerful thing. Caleb knew that if Blackwell's men didn't get to him first, it would be the bounty hunters who would come for the ledger. And Caleb didn't have much time to get ahead of them. That night, as Caleb prepared for the journey, Levisa came to him, her face set with a quiet resolve. We'll see this through together, she said, her voice firm. I'll get Martha to safety. You'll get Samuel the justice he deserves. Caleb met her gaze. I don't know what we'll face along the way, but we'll get it done. Levisa's lips curled into a faint smile. We always do. The next morning, the group set off in their separate directions. Caleb led the way with Samuel and Tom, each of them riding hard, keeping a careful eye on the trail behind them. As they rode, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but he pushed it aside. They had a long way to go, and Blackwell's men were likely already on their trail. The journey ahead would be filled with danger, but Caleb had made up his mind. He wasn't going to stop until Samuel had his day in court, no matter what it cost him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb's thoughts turned to Levisa, to the promise of something more between them, and to the future they could have together if they made it through this alive. There would be no turning back. The ride north was grueling, the landscape unforgiving as Caleb, Samuel, and Tom pressed on, their horses strained under the weight of their riders and the ever-looming threat of Blackwell's men closing in on them. Caleb's mind raced with thoughts of how to get the ledger to Cheyenne. Each mile they rode seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the harsh winds whipping against their faces, the chill of the Wyoming wilderness biting into their bones. Samuel, weakened from days of fever and hunger, pushed through, determined not to let the evidence fall into Blackwell's hands. Tom's condition was worsening too. Despite Caleb's attempts to keep him patched up, the wound on his shoulder was becoming more infected by the hour. The trio made camp at night in the shelter of a small grove, taking turns keeping watch. Caleb lay awake, staring at the dark sky, listening to the howling wind, knowing they were running out of time. Every creak of the trees made him flinch. Every shadow in the distance could have been Blackwell's men. He tried to push the worry aside, but the doubt gnawed at him. Were they already too far behind? Were they too exposed to survive? It was impossible to tell. The following morning, as the trio continued their journey, Caleb's unease grew. The land had begun to take on a different character. Narrow canyons and steep, rocky paths that made travel slow and dangerous. As they rounded a bend in the path, Caleb saw them, a group of riders, 6 in total, moving slowly but steadily toward them. He recognized their faces immediately. Wade Garrett, Blackwell's enforcer, was leading them. Caleb's blood ran cold. The memory of the man's chilling smile when he had visited the ranch was still fresh in his mind. Caleb knew this was no coincidence. Garrett was here for the ledger, and he wouldn't stop until he got it. The 3 men spurred their horses into action, but the canyon was too narrow, the terrain too treacherous to outrun their pursuers. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and soon the men were upon them. Caleb's heart pounded as he made a quick decision. There was no chance of outrunning them in this terrain, but they couldn't afford to stop either. The only way out was to fight. He pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard, signaling to Tom and Samuel to do the same. They made a quick stand on the edge of the canyon, their backs against the rocky wall, hoping the terrain would give them some cover. Garrett's men circled them, keeping a safe distance, waiting for them to make a move. Wade Garrett rode forward slowly, his expression unreadable. "End of the line, Thornton," he called out, his voice carrying in the still air. "You've made a mistake helping those 2. Hand them over now, and you can walk away. Resist, and I'll make sure you regret it." Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle, but he refused to give in to fear. "I'm not giving them to you," he said evenly. "These people are witnesses to Blackwell's crimes. You're the ones who should be arrested, not them." Garrett's face twisted with disdain. "Crimes?" he sneered. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with, Thornton. You're out of your depth here. Blackwell owns this land, and he owns you. Turn them over now, and I'll make sure you don't suffer." Caleb knew he had to act fast. Every second they stood there, the more vulnerable they became. The wind was picking up again, the sound of the storm in the distance growing louder. This was their moment. "We're not handing anyone over," Caleb said, his voice steady but firm. "This ends now." Without warning, he fired a warning shot, the bullet crashing into the rocks beside Garrett. The silence that followed was deafening. Wade Garrett flinched, but didn't flinch away. He raised his hand, signaling for his men to dismount. "You really think you're going to survive this?" he taunted. "You're outnumbered, and we've got the high ground. You're done." But Caleb wasn't listening anymore. He motioned to Tom and Samuel. They were already moving, their rifles raised, ready for whatever came next. The next few minutes passed in a blur of chaos. The sound of gunshots filled the air as Caleb and his group fired in unison, forcing Garrett's men to scatter. Tom, despite his injuries, managed to get off a few accurate shots, sending 2 of Garrett's men scrambling for cover. But Caleb knew it wouldn't be enough. Garrett was a trained killer, and he wouldn't go down easily. One of Garrett's men, taking advantage of the confusion, made a break for the ridge above them. Caleb spotted him just in time, firing off a shot that took the man down. Another of Garrett's men took a shot at Caleb, grazing his arm, but the wound was superficial. Caleb gritted his teeth and kept fighting, his focus narrowing to the present moment. They had to survive this. They couldn't give up. As the gunfire intensified, the ground beneath them began to shake. Caleb realized with a jolt that they had to move. "Get to the horses," he shouted, grabbing Samuel by the arm. "We can't stay here." The group scrambled toward the horses, hearts racing as they fought to stay ahead of the gunfire. In the chaos, Tom was hit again, this time in the leg. He went down hard, but Caleb didn't hesitate. He scooped Tom up, throwing him over one of the horses, and kicked the animal into motion. "Go, go, go," Caleb shouted. "Get to the tree line." They charged forward, galloping as fast as the horses could carry them. Behind them, Garrett's men regrouped and gave chase. Caleb's mind raced. They needed a plan. They couldn't outrun them for long. But they had a small window. If they could make it to the trees and find shelter, they might just have a chance to escape. The trees came into view, a dark line against the sky. Caleb pushed his horse harder, ignoring the pain in his arm as the adrenaline surged through him. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced over his shoulder. Garrett's men were gaining on them. The distance between them was closing and fast. But Caleb didn't slow. As they neared the trees, Caleb turned to Samuel. "We make our stand here," he said. "It's our only chance." They rode into the cover of the trees, dismounting quickly and finding shelter behind thick trunks. Caleb positioned himself with a clear line of sight to the oncoming riders, his rifle aimed and ready. The sound of galloping hooves grew louder. Soon, Garrett's men broke through the trees, unaware of the ambush that was waiting for them. The moment they entered the clearing, Caleb and Tom opened fire. One of Garrett's men fell immediately, the other reeling back in surprise. Garrett, who had been bringing up the rear, cursed loudly, realizing too late that they had been lured into a trap. He ordered his men to return fire, but the odds were now against them. As the gunfight raged, Caleb's focus was unshakable. He had to keep Samuel safe. This was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. After a tense few minutes, Garrett's remaining men hesitated, their spirits breaking as they realized they were being outgunned. Garrett, ever the coward, gave the order to retreat, his voice laced with fury. "Fall back. Get out of here," he shouted, pulling his horse around and riding back toward the ridge. Caleb's group had won the battle, but they knew it wasn't over yet. They had made it out of the ambush alive, but Garrett would be back, and they still had to escape. With adrenaline still coursing through his veins, Caleb quickly checked his group. Tom was bleeding heavily, but he was still conscious. Samuel had managed to make it through the fight unharmed, but there was no time to celebrate. "We got to move," Caleb said, his voice low. "We're not out of this yet." They moved quickly, their horses galloping hard toward the next phase of their journey. They had survived the worst, but the war for justice had only just begun. The sun had barely risen when the group pressed on, leaving the chaos of the canyon behind them. Their escape had been narrowly executed, but the cost was visible in Tom's pale face, his leg wound worsening with every painful step the horse made. Caleb's eyes remained on the horizon, scanning for any sign of Garrett's men in pursuit. The ride had been relentless, but now, with Tom barely conscious and Samuel's weakened state worsening, Caleb knew they had to reach the next town fast, or their chances of survival would dwindle. The day seemed to stretch on forever. Every few miles, Caleb would glance back to check the trail, heart sinking with each passing moment. The narrow pass had left them exposed to danger, and now, in the open, the threat of Blackwell's men was ever present. They had no time to lose, but Caleb couldn't afford to push the horses too hard either. Tom's condition was critical, his breath shallow and his face flushed with fever, and Samuel was struggling to hold himself together as the stress of the journey wore him down. The memory of the ambush in the canyon was fresh in Caleb's mind, and his hand instinctively rested on the rifle that hung at his side. His mind wandered back to that moment, to Garrett's angry retreat, but Caleb knew better than to think they were safe. Wade Garrett had always been ruthless, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Caleb and his group weren't just running from him anymore. They were running from the past, from Blackwell's twisted empire that had left a trail of destruction in its wake. Caleb's thoughts were interrupted as they reached the edge of a dense forest, and the faint sounds of a wagon came from up ahead. He raised a hand, signaling for the group to stop. "Wait here," he said, his voice tense. He crept forward, keeping to the shadows as he approached the source of the noise. His heart pounded in his chest as he peered around the corner of the trees, where he spotted two men driving a wagon slowly toward them. His eyes narrowed as he recognized one of them. It was Cole, one of Garrett's men, the one who had hesitated during the ambush. Caleb's instincts kicked in. Cole had switched sides, and now it seemed he was coming to help. Caleb stepped out of hiding, his hand raised in a greeting. "Cole," he called quietly. The man turned, his eyes widening in surprise before recognition set in. He pulled the wagon to a stop, his face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Caleb Thornton," Cole said, his voice strained. "Thought I'd never see you again." Caleb stepped forward, motioning for the group to approach. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, still cautious. Cole shifted uneasily, looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was following. "I couldn't stay with Garrett," he said, his voice bitter. "Not after what happened in that canyon. I couldn't kill for Blackwell anymore. I've seen too much. I've lost too much." He paused, his eyes dark with regret. "I came to help. I heard the bounty hunters were out looking for you, and I knew you'd be in trouble. I've got a way to get you to Cheyenne safely." Caleb's gaze flickered to the rest of the group, wondering if they could trust Cole. The man had been one of Blackwell's enforcers, but his conscience seemed to have turned. Still, Caleb had seen enough treachery in his life to know that people who switch sides often had their own hidden agendas. But Cole's sincerity was unmistakable. His face, once hard and cold, now showed a vulnerability Caleb hadn't expected. "You came all this way for us?" Caleb asked, his voice skeptical. "What's the catch?" Cole hesitated, looking down at the ground as though struggling with his own demons. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said finally. "I'm not even asking for a reward. I just can't live with myself anymore, knowing what I did. But I know where Blackwell's men are camped out. I can help you avoid them." Caleb weighed his options, glancing back at Tom, whose condition had deteriorated even further. His fever had risen, and his breath came in ragged bursts. Samuel wasn't much better, his movements slow and deliberate as he fought to keep up. They didn't have the luxury of time. Caleb made a snap decision. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "We'll take your help. But if you try anything, I won't hesitate to put you down." Cole nodded, his face solemn. "Understood. Just give me a chance to make things right." The wagon became their temporary refuge, and Cole led them through back roads and narrow trails, away from the main paths where Blackwell's men were likely to be waiting. For the first time in days, Caleb allowed himself to relax, even if only a little. The road to Cheyenne was still long, and the danger was far from over, but for now, they had a chance. As night fell, they made camp in a small clearing near stream. Caleb set up a watch, knowing that Blackwell's men wouldn't be far behind. It wasn't long before Samuel pulled Caleb aside, his expression grim. "There's something I haven't told you," Samuel said, his voice low. "Something you need to know before we get to Cheyenne." Caleb's heart sank. "What is it?" Samuel hesitated, then pulled something from his coat. Another small ledger, this one thinner than the first. "This is the original," Samuel said, his voice shaking. "The one Blackwell has been searching for all these years. The one that proves everything." Caleb's mind raced. The stakes had just been raised. The ledger Samuel had been carrying was a decoy. This one was the key to Blackwell's empire, and if they could get it to the marshal, it would bring everything crashing down. But now, there was no turning back. Garrett and his men were already closing in, and the closer they got to Cheyenne, the more dangerous it would become. "We have to get this to the marshal," Caleb said, his voice urgent. "No matter the cost." Samuel nodded, his face drawn with fatigue. "I know. This is bigger than just us now. It's about stopping Blackwell, about making sure he can't hurt anyone else." The next morning, they set off again, the weight of the original ledger pressing down on them like a curse. Cole led them through the dense forests, keeping them hidden from any would-be trackers. They traveled for days, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses and tend to Tom's wound, which had become increasingly infected. As they neared the town of Cheyenne, the tension reached a breaking point. Caleb knew that once they reached the federal marshal, they would finally have a chance to bring Blackwell to justice. But they weren't there yet. Garrett's men were still out there, and they were closer than ever. They had no more time to waste. As they crossed the final ridge, Caleb's eyes locked onto the silhouette of Cheyenne on the horizon. This was it, their final destination. But even as hope swelled in his chest, he could feel the weight of the inevitable battle ahead. They had made it this far, but the final fight was yet to come. The marshal would need to be convinced, and Blackwell's men would stop at nothing to get the ledger back. Caleb turned to Samuel, his voice firm. "When we get to town, don't let anyone out of your sight. We'll get the marshal, and then this will all be over." Samuel nodded, his face a mask of determination. "We've come too far to fail now, Caleb." As they rode the final miles into Cheyenne, Caleb's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. For Samuel, for the miners, for the families who had been destroyed by Blackwell's greed. They had to win this fight. For justice. For the truth. The sun had barely risen over Cheyenne when Caleb and the others made their final push toward the federal courthouse. The streets of the town were still quiet, the early morning mist clinging to the ground as if the town itself were holding its breath. The group, battered and bruised from days of travel and constant danger, rode into the heart of the town, their horses weary but determined. Tom was barely able to sit up on his horse, his wound worse than ever, but he refused to give in. Samuel, despite his fatigue, still held the ledger close, his hand shaking with the weight of it. Caleb could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down on them all. This was it, the final stretch. He had to get the ledger into the right hands, and he couldn't afford to fail now. As they approached the courthouse, Caleb's eyes scanned the buildings around them, watching for any sign of danger. He had no illusions about Cheyenne being a safe haven. Blackwell's reach was long, and his men could be anywhere. The marshal's office, though, was their only hope. The federal authorities were their last shot at stopping Blackwell, and Caleb would be damned if he let this opportunity slip away. They dismounted, quickly leading the horses to the hitching post. Caleb motioned for Samuel to follow him, and the two of them walked toward the courthouse. Tom and Cole stayed behind, their eyes constantly scanning the street for any sign of movement. As they entered the building, Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. The place was quiet, the high ceilings echoing with their footsteps as they walked down the long hallway. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. Caleb knocked twice, his knuckles rapping against the wood. A deep voice responded from inside. "Come in." Caleb opened the door slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Behind the desk sat a man in his mid-40s, a rugged face framed by dark hair and a thick mustache. He looked up as they entered, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cold but not unkind. Caleb stepped forward, his hand gripping the ledger tightly. "Marshal Thompson?" he asked. "We need your help." The marshal studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'm Marshal Thompson," he said, "and I don't take kindly to strangers just walking into my office demanding favors." Caleb didn't flinch. "We're not asking for a favor," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're here because we have something that belongs to a man who's been stealing, lying, and murdering for years. His name is Harrison Blackwell, and he's been running this entire territory with an iron fist." The marshal raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. Caleb took a deep breath and continued. "This ledger," he held it up, "contains everything. The fraud, the embezzlement, the bribery, the deaths. It's all here. Blackwell has been cutting corners for years, all to line his pockets. He's responsible for the deaths of 17 men in a mine collapse 3 years ago, and he's been covering it up ever since." Samuel stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. "I used to work for Blackwell. I was his chief accountant. I discovered what he was doing, but when I tried to confront him, he threatened me and my wife. So we left, but we kept the evidence. It's all in this ledger." Marshall Thompson leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ledger in Caleb's hands. "You're saying this is the evidence that'll bring him down?" he asked, his voice skeptical but not dismissive. Caleb nodded. "I'm saying it's enough to convict him. Blackwell may control everything around here, but he doesn't own you. This is bigger than all of us. It's time someone stood up to him." The marshal sat in silence for a moment, considering the words. He didn't look convinced, but something in his eyes softened. He reached out and took the ledger from Caleb's hands, flipping through the pages slowly. As he read, the room seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with the weight of what was at stake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marshall Thompson looked up. "I'll get this to the right people," he said quietly. "I'll send for a judge and get a warrant. This is what we've been waiting for. Blackwell's reign of terror is over." Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with relief. The marshal stood, his chair creaking as he rose. "This isn't over," he said, his tone grave. "We have to move fast. Blackwell will stop at nothing to cover his tracks, and he has men everywhere. We'll need protection before we can make any moves." Caleb nodded. "We'll help however we can." The marshal walked to the window, his hand resting on the frame as he gazed out at the bustling street below. "Blackwell's been a shadow over this town for too long," he said quietly. "It's time that shadow is lifted." Caleb felt a flicker of hope, but it was brief. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. "We still need to get Samuel's testimony," Caleb said, his mind racing ahead. "Once we get the warrant, we'll need to act fast. Blackwell's men could be here any minute." The marshal turned back to him, his face hardening. "I'm aware of the risks," he said, his voice cold. "But this is what I do. We'll get you through this, Thornton. You've done the right thing, and now we'll make sure it counts." Outside, the streets had begun to fill with the sounds of people waking up, the low hum of daily life continuing on despite the storm that was about to hit. But in the courthouse, a different storm was brewing. Caleb, Samuel, and Marshall Thompson all knew that Blackwell wasn't going to take this line down. The real fight was just beginning. Later that day, the marshals sent word that a judge had been summoned, and the wheels of justice were set into motion. But as Caleb left the courthouse, a feeling of unease crept over him. They were far from safe. Blackwell would have heard about the ledger by now, and his men would be closing in. The only thing standing between Blackwell's empire and the truth was a fragile thread of hope. As Caleb and Samuel made their way back to the small inn where they were staying, they were stopped by a rider who came from the direction of the courthouse. It was an urgent message from a marshal. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as he took the note. "Blackwell's men are on their way," the note read. "We need to get out of here now." Without a second thought, Caleb turned to Samuel. "Get your things. We're moving out." They gathered their belongings quickly, knowing that time was running out. But as they stepped out of the inn, Caleb froze. A group of Blackwell's men were riding toward them, their cold eyes scanning the streets. The game had changed. There was no more time for running. The final confrontation was about to begin. As Caleb's hand hovered over his rifle, he knew this was it, the moment that would decide everything. Blackwell's men were closing in, and they had nowhere to hide. This was the fight they had all been waiting for, and Caleb wasn't about to let Blackwell win. Samuel's hand gripped his arm tightly. "This is it, Caleb," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We've come this far. There's no turning back." Caleb nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the moment that would change everything. They couldn't stop now. This was the last chance to bring Blackwell to justice. As the first gunshot rang out, Caleb knew the time for waiting was over. They had come to Cheyenne for justice, and now they would fight for it.